So I finished Dishonored 2 and had intended to do a write-up of that game this month, but that kind of became a comparison between Dishonored 2 and Thief 2, and then that kind of became a retrospective of Looking Glass and the history of 0451 games, and that kind of exploded into some sort of thinking about whether immersive sims are a rigid genre or simply an aesthetic, and basically the whole script spiraled out of control into a much, much bigger thing than I could finish in time. So I'm still working on that, but since it won't be done for at least a little while, I figured we'd look at something a little bit smaller in scope, and even maybe something a little bit more of the times. Let's take a look at Playdead's Inside. Released in July of last year, Inside is Playdead's follow-up to 2010's dreary grayscale Limbo. Combined, they both sort of form something of a house style. Dark and atmospheric puzzle platformers where a little boy travels right a whole lot. And while that style certainly has some cool recurring themes, which we'll get to in a little bit, I've never really been all that impressed with their approach to puzzle design. It always felt a bit, well, cheap and artificial. If you want a classic example, take this puzzle in Limbo. Your immediate assumption is that pressing the big button under the piston is what will kill you, but it's actually the ground beside the piston that will kill you. Which, okay, you die once to learn that mechanic, whatever, but next to it is another piston with the same setup, except this one does trigger based on the button in the middle. It's just a mean trick to play on the player and embodies this approach of having puzzles kill you to announce their presence, and is the only way of telling you you're screwing up. Thankfully, Inside doesn't have any puzzles quite so deviously manipulative of player expectations, but it does run into its own problems by exploring the same approach to puzzle design. Take the opening of the game, for example, which has this sort of E.T. vibe to it. Authorities are scouring the woods for our young protagonist, but with some quick thinking and a few close calls, he can get away. It feels like the level design's pacing is all about flowing from one scene to the next. These aren't big, show-stopping, stop and figure out some stuff puzzles, they're just the do something real quick so you don't die kind of puzzles that border on QuickTime events, to keep the pacing of the pursuit up. But because of the way the game announces puzzles by having you die first, the minute-to-minute gameplay undercuts all of the tension of the escape. Like, watch how cool intense it is for me to do this having beaten the game. Now watch how doing it the first time feels repetitive, and how after the first death the tension just evaporates. If these puzzles were telegraphed more clearly, they may be easier, to the point of basically being trivial, but if you want the sense of an exciting chase through the woods that happens in one motion, they kind of have to be trivial. Otherwise you get this stop-and-go storytelling as the players die, figure out the intended solution to this little bit, play it over, move on to the next little bit, die, figure it out, play it over, etc. It's like framing Elliot and E.T.'s escape into the woods as Run Lola Run. But that's mostly a criticism of the game's pursuit sequences, and there are only a few of those in the game. The game's slower and more complicated puzzles actually tend to fare much better. They're basically order of operations spatial puzzles. Where Portal or Jonathan Blow's work have you wrapping your head around unexpected use of space and time, and games like Antichamber have you thinking outside of the box entirely. Playdead's games just have the crate, or lever, or rope, or monster to avoid, and you know you need to use or dodge each of them. It's just a matter of order and placement. Really, they border on being a hybrid of puzzle platformer puzzles and traditional adventure game puzzles, and that's not a complaint. By focusing on simple environmental puzzles, Inside avoids making the mechanics the focal point the way they are in those other games, and really lets its environmental work, which is clearly the focus here, shine through. It's a puzzle game that's less about making you or the designer feel clever than it is a game about giving you something to do as you wander through these evocative environments. Call it the walking sim of puzzle platformers if you want, but it works for what it's trying to do. If I do have one nitpick about these bigger puzzles, it's that I'm not sure Playdead has really figured out how to deal with the artifice of these sorts of things. It's something that most puzzle platformers have to lampshade in some way, or the absurdity of having everything you need to progress right in front of you starts feeling a little weird in the context of the narrative. It's sort of like how found footage movies need to eventually address why the cameras are always rolling, even if it's a crappy excuse, because if they don't confront it at all, the conceit itself becomes really distracting. Like, Portal does this by saying most of the game is a series of test chambers designed to be beaten. Myst does it by saying the entire world is authored by writers with secrets on their minds. And Jonathan Blow's games confront the artificiality of their puzzles by leaning into the fact that these are games and rejecting verisimilitude outright. But Inside's puzzles aren't authored or constructed for our protagonist, they're just the next thing the kid finds when running continuously in one direction. And the game's emphasis on a contiguous, atmospheric, lived-in world makes the convenience of a lot of these puzzles stand out. It's perhaps even worse here than in Limbo. At least Limbo had this sort of dreamlike surreality about it. Here it's just this odd thing that you're in a sci-fi dystopia where every button and door is inconveniently placed such that it will kill you if you go straight for it, but if you move some things around in the room the right way and in the right order, you can continue to move in a straight line ad infinitum. The monsters always run just fast enough to make this puzzle exist, and you always run just fast enough to be able to get out the door. They're so meticulously and clearly intentionally designed that they rarely feel natural or a product of the environment itself, which detracts from the game's otherwise razor-sharp focus on the setting and tone. Because really, that's where the game shines. Mechanically, it's just a serviceable puzzle platformer, but it's the environmental trip the game takes you on that really captivates. Where Limbo felt like a series of vaguely interconnected set pieces, there's definitely a progression to Inside. From the forest to the rural industrial outskirts of the city to the human procurement center and beyond, you're definitely traveling deeper and deeper into the heart of whatever is wrong with this society. And that journey is brought to life with some really great sound design. Yeah, we can joke about the gimmick with recording the music inside of a human skull and how goofy that is, but gimmick or no, the final output matches the game really well. There's a clarity, crispness, and focus to a lot of the diegetic sound effects that contrasts with the droning, whining, distant ambient music. But all of it is cloaked in coldness, whether it's the vague buzzes and shrill creaks of the soundtrack, or the harsh slap of shoes as you land on wooden boards, or the metallic clicker-clack of a chain as you climb. And that aural indifference is amplified by a game that is somehow at once beautiful and alienating. It plays bold color choices against an otherwise desaturated palette, and the result is a setting that feels like it was once thriving and vibrant but has fallen under a shadow. Whether it's the protagonist's bright red shirt, or the yellow submersible, or the green leaves of corn, there are splashes of color that stand out but are still muted. Inside's world is ominous, threatening, but also more than a little bit sad. It conveys a vague sense that events far beyond your control and understanding are drawing to an inevitable conclusion, and you are by twist of fate simply there to witness them. A lot of this lost optimism is echoed by the game's retro-future approach to tech. Most of the time, a retro-futurist aesthetic is chosen ironically and to humorous ends. Think Venture Brothers or Fallout. But here it feels like an earnest way of framing this society's fall. I think it's safe to say that Inside is ultimately less a mechanical or narrative game than it is a game about tone, and that tone is really well balanced to be evocatively somber and wistful without being self-important or even specific about what drives those feelings. It's a video game equivalent of music that really resonates with you if you're in the mood, and more often than not lately, yeah, this sad and lost and regretful mix has been a tone I felt the need to vibe on. I don't know if I like playing Inside, I don't know if the puzzles really do anything for me, but I do feel like it's a game that I got something out of playing right now, in this moment in time. All of that tone stuff said, it's not like there's no narrative, and the game does toy with a few thematic ideas. The game's core concern is clearly control, in one sense or another. Just about every force in the game is either being controlled by or is controlling something else, and their agency or lack thereof is at the forefront. This manifests in some obvious ways. The government controls the drones, and over time you also gain the ability to control the drones, and the evil government forces are clearly trying to control you. But that's mostly surface-level plot stuff. There's a lot of other more subtle nods to this idea. Like, the pig you run into early in the game seems to be infested with one of the worms from Limbo that forces you to do whatever it wants, effectively removing the pig's autonomy. Also, while at the farm, the player character seems to have no compunction about blasting baby chicks at a crate to knock it down for his use. You also occasionally control drones who, to solve a puzzle, end up controlling drones themselves. This is a bit of foreshadowing to the game's ultimate secret, that the player character is implicitly being controlled as well. The puzzle to get here is needlessly complicated, and I hate it when games bury some of their subtext in secrets that require collecting all of the hidden things, but if you follow a walkthrough to get the hidden ending, it basically reveals a room with a brain control hat in front of a series of computers, along with a plug that, once yanked, kind of shuts the kid down like all of the other unplugged drones. The obvious reading is that this is supposed to be you, the player controlling the kid the way the kid controlled the drones, that this chain of manipulation extends outward from the game itself and into the real world. The idea being that you, the player, are complicit in this sort of manipulative behavior, of turning others into the physical embodiment of your will. I've also seen it argued that the collective blob at the end may be what's controlling the kid, but I get the sense that this borders on more of a fan theory than criticism. Basically, it explains the kid's motivations for running into the lab and freeing the blob instead of running away, and it explains why you can singularly control the blob once you're a part of it. But there's nothing else really in the text that supports the idea that the blob is the one controlling you. It just sort of explains away control conceits and questionable player motivation, so it's a little fanficky for me. But still, it's not unsupported by the text, and it fits thematically, so sure, the kid might be controlled by the blob. Speaking of, there's one thing I love about the collective blob thing that you kind of join at the end. It's the culmination of a pattern throughout the game. See, the drones start as empathetic, regular people that seem to have been twisted and broken by whatever evil force is taking over the world. They look sad, and you kind of want to help them. But then once you start controlling them, they start to present as just workers or engineers rather than everyday civilians. You know, overalls, hard hats, that whole thing. They're less immediately sad and more eager to just do work for you as your power over them grows. Then, closer to the end of the game, the drones you're working with are malformed and only barely humanoid-ish. At this point, you're throwing them off ledges and dropping them down chutes and don't really care about them at all. They're just a means to an end, and their decreased humanity reflects this. And then finally at the end, when you bind with the collective blob, they literally are simply an extension of your body. There is no sad individual you're abusing. There's not even a worker bee or a blob of meat that you need to send somewhere. They are simply viewed as a part of your body and will. And as far as themes of control go, I love this idea. What start as people, sad, frail, and broken under someone else's control, ultimately become identityless biotools under your authority. So yeah, I like that motif, and that gets a thumbs up. At the end of the day, though, all of this control stuff is pretty vague. You could just as easily read it as commentary on labor as on government, or virtually any other scenario where one person is using the bodies of another to accomplish their own aims. And it's so backgrounded against moving boxes around and pressing buttons in the right order, as well as the focus on all the tone stuff, that I'm not sure it really says anything particularly useful or interesting about control other than to have agency is often to have control of others, and that control inherently dehumanizes them in your eyes. Which isn't bad or untrue, but I feel like it needs to be taken further or explored more deeply. As it is, it's kind of a bumper sticker theme. It's there, but it's not really explored in any depth. If there is one part of the narrative that works for me, it's the very end. Like I said, as a tone piece it works really well and captures the atmosphere of now, even though it was released half a year ago when things were just crappy instead of terrifying and sad. But despite all of the gloom, our protagonist does find his freedom, of a sort. Breaking through a final wall at the very end of the game, the collective blob bounces down a hill before it settles on a small grassy knoll by the seaside, bathed in sunlight. The camera slowly pans back, and perhaps for the first time in the game, things feel almost peaceful. The conflicts about authority and the manipulation of others are literally behind him, and even the player's input is removed. You could read this as saying that the only way to escape fights for power are to go outside the systems that generated them. That ties nicely into the title, but is kind of nihilistic and fruitless. I'm not sure how you step entirely outside of labor or governance. So instead, for now, I'm going to look at it more optimistically, that systems to manipulate and control others can be escaped, beaten back, broken, or survived, and while there are often casualties, and you aren't likely to come out the other end unscathed or unchanged, there is hope. These systems are not permanent or omnipotent and can be held at bay with empathy and unity. And that might be a bit sentimental or naive, but I feel like right now it's either that or fully succumbing to the game's otherwise cold, bleak view that if you're not in control, you're somebody else's mindless drone. You know, if the blob really is controlling the boy, that pushes this game to a super dark place thematically, because the default ending frames the blob as wanting to escape from the powers that be, even if it kills it, and the secret ending frames the boy as wanting to escape from the power of the blob, even if it kills him. Jeez. Maybe this game's darker than I thought.